Hello and welcome to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Mil Arcega in Washington. Well, in a move that could further complicate matters in the Middle East, Iran has confirmed that Russia is using Iranian airbases to launch airstrikes in Syria. The first launch of Russian bombers came on Tuesday, with a second wave of bombers decimating targets in the war-ravaged country on Wednesday. The development represents a historical rapprochement between Russia and Iran that could rile U.S. allied Gulf neighbors and strengthen Syrian President Bashar Assad's hold on power, not to mention its impact on the war against Islamic State. In Moscow, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov defended Russia's use of Iranian military bases, and he rejected new allegations that it might be a serious violation of several UN resolutions. And joining us now to talk about the latest developments in that troubled region, we are joined by VOA Senior Diplomatic Correspondent Steve Herman, who joins us in Washington. Thank you very much. Along with VOA National Security Correspondent Jeff Seldin. It's good to have both of you gentlemen on the program. But Stephen, welcome first of all. First time on the set. Yeah, every time I talk to you, you're always on Skype, so it's really good to have you here. So let's talk about this. Russia using Iranian air bases. How much of a game changer is that?
Well, it is definitely a setback from the point of view of the United States. And we've had, as we know so far, according to the Russians, 3 missions that have gone from the air bases there. U.S. officials on the record are playing it down to some degree. We know that this also comes at a time where there have been intense discussions off camera between Moscow and Washington about getting a ceasefire in place and looking for a longer-term solution. But it's very typical that the Russians are doing one thing maybe with the United States and doing other things that will also upset the U.S. at the same point.
Jeff Seldin, do you agree with Steve Herman's point that this could further complicate a U.S. allied response in that area?
Well, it makes everything very complicated because there are so many tensions already within the region. I mean, right now, for the U.S., much of the focus is on destroying the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. But there are many other objectives that countries in the region are meeting. You have a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia in Yemen that's been going on. You have other Gulf nations that have tensions with Iran. So they may start thinking, well, if there's more of a conflagration and more of a conflict with Iran and something happens, are they now also in conflict with the Russians? And it may, so there could be fallout along those lines, but there's also a lot of, at least in the military and the intelligence community, a lot of focus on what is Russia, what is Iran trying to do with these airstrikes. And while the U.S. is focused on the Islamic State, the strikes and military buildup and what seems to be more recruitment and more troops on the ground by Iran, their militias in Syria, it seems to be a push to make sure that the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, does not lose his grip on power.
Yeah, I think it's important to mention that while there are some strikes on IS targets by the Russian aircraft, that according to the U.S. military, most of the strikes seem to be on moderate opposition forces in Syria, which, of course, the United States is trying to support. So you get into, as Jeff is referring to, a sort of a complex structure of, if you ever seen those charts of the Middle East, who's my enemy's enemy is my friend and type of thing. And so this just adds one more complex dimension to an already complicated
This is, in fact, a very complicated conflict. I mean, we've got so many moving parts, so many different players there. Some of them want Bashar al-Assad to stay, some don't, but all of them want to get rid of ISIS. So how would you explain this to a casual observer? What is going on in Syria?
Well, it's even more complicated than that because while a lot of people say they want to get rid of the Islamic State, that's not necessarily true. Even with Iran, which says it's fighting Islamic State and says periodically it's taken apart a cell here or there, there are theories and there's some thoughts within the intelligence community that sometimes they like the presence of Islamic State. They like having an extremist Sunni group that's there causing problems because it strengthens their case that they're needed as a regional power. So not everybody, and sometimes even the groups in Syria, the rebel groups, even some of the moderate ones, will occasionally team up with Islamic State because their objectives in that particular situation, in that particular battle space align. So not everybody wants to get rid of Islamic State. Not everybody wants to get rid of Assad. Even with the United States, the position is that President Assad of Syria must step down and move away, but it's not doing anything overtly to make that happen. Instead, it's supporting rebels, and for a long time only supported rebels who were supporting a campaign against the Islamic State and not against the Assad regime.
And Stephen Herman sort of hammering home this point that you mentioned earlier, that this war is not just about Islamic State. We saw some haunting images this week, heartbreaking images, really, of a 5-year-old covered in soot, blood coming from his face. That has to certainly, more than almost any image we've seen, humanize the face of this war.
Absolutely. Tragic as it is, this helps to put this story back on the front pages at the top of the newscasts around the world, because admittedly, talking to diplomats and correspondents, there's been a bit of fatigue about the Syria story. And when we see something like that, the picture of this boy, it really drives home that the people that are suffering from every side in this conflict are the civilians.
Jeff Seldin, obviously this boy is ostensibly the victim of one of the Russian airstrikes, but I understand that Russia is already sort of pushing back on that whole idea. Are they being kind of defensive about this new image that we're seeing?
Well, Russia takes a different tack when it comes to airstrikes than the United States. The United States, when it conducts airstrikes, whether it's the Defense Department or other U.S. officials, always emphasize how they're surgical strikes, how every precaution is taken not to hit civilians.
So surgical,
the Russians, if you hear U.S. military officials talk about it, don't worry about that. If they see a target, they'll take out the target, and they don't worry about the collateral damage, as it's called, the civilian casualties. And in fact, there were some groups that have come out with some statistics just this past week saying that Russian airstrikes have now killed almost as many people in Syria as the Islamic State.
So do you think images like this might sort of discourage some of that collateral damage? I mean, or some of the sensitivities to that?
So I think we're both skeptical on that.
Yeah. The problem is images like this, even though it raises awareness and it pulls at the heartstrings to see a child in that situation, the options on the ground for the various parties, considering that the international powers simply can't get together on what to do, haven't been able to agree on a plan, and often, despite a lot of language saying they're all in it together, are working at different aims, there's only so many options on the ground. So it's a tragic situation, but realistically, is there anything that's going to be able to change the scenario in Syria to stop the fighting, to pull the warring parties apart? Not really.
I see you shaking your head, Stephen.
Well, there is no military solution to this conflict. I don't know of anybody who would disagree with that statement. The problem is, are you going to be able to reach a diplomatic solution? Secretary John Kerry is really committed to that, but and despite negotiations that are going on behind the scenes between the United States and Russia to take things in a different direction, there's considerable skepticism that anything significant is going to change. This is also the fifth anniversary of the Obama administration calling for the removal of Assad, and he is still entrenched there after 5 years.
Well, you're in the State Department now, so I'm sure we're going to hear more from you. You got 5 seconds.
And one other thing interesting to note with the Russian airstrikes out of Iran, at times the Russians and the Iranians haven't even agreed on what should happen in Syria. So that makes it even more significant that they're now working together, at least for the time being.
Well, I appreciate the reporting from both of you gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us, Steve and Jeff. Time now for a quick break, but Steve is going to join us again for another segment on North Korea. Back in the news again. This time with a high-level defection and renewed nuclear activity. That's not sitting very well with Washington. This is the Correspondents on Voice of America.